You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 182. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Let me ask you a question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much is clutter weighing you down? Maybe you're at the lower end of the spectrum, a 1 or a 2, and you're thinking, you know what, Paula, clutter isn't so much a problem in my life. Or maybe you're closer to a 7 or an 8, maybe even a 9, right? You might find that your physical spaces are starting to get a bit cluttered. Even your more mental spaces or your calendar, there are all these ways where clutter may be showing up for you. And if that's the case, today's podcast episode is for you. Clutter is one of those things that can literally start to pile up. We often don't even notice it at first, right? It's a bit here and there. But once we start to see it, we cannot unsee it. Clutter comes in all different shapes and sizes. There's the clutter that we often think of first, which is that physical clutter, right? So you might be thinking about your workspaces, your surfaces, right? The countertops in your house or the surfaces of your dresser. You might think of that physical clutter that's a little bit more hidden, right? It's behind the closet doors. It's that mystery drawer in your kitchen. Maybe you've got a garage or a shed where you put clutter. There's also other forms of clutter, though, like mental clutter. Decisions that you are ruminating over, upcoming events that maybe you're thinking about, decisions that you have made or you don't want to make. You might be second guessing a decision you've already made, replaying a conversation that you've already had. You might be beating yourself up for something that's already happened. That can be mental clutter. You may have emotional clutter, right? These feelings that kind of feel like they're trapped, feelings like guilt or shame or anxiety, doubt, loneliness. You might try avoiding that type of clutter by distracting yourself, keeping busy, or generating some fresh clutter. You might have time clutter, right? You might see that your calendar is not a reflection of what you really want. You might find there's a lot of busy work on there, maybe committees that you're a part of or conversations that you're having or scrolling, non-billable projects. Maybe again, you're ruminating over decisions that you haven't made. You're complaining about something that keeps recurring in your life. Maybe there are social engagements that you're going to that you don't really want to, but you don't feel like you want to say no to them either. You might have writing clutter. So this might happen in your work where you're drafting an email or you're drafting a memo or you're writing an opinion and you notice there's a lot of words there. And what you're finding is actually, if you were to reduce the clutter, it would be a much cleaner argument, a much neater email. And finally, maybe you have people clutter, right? Not nice to think about, but maybe there are individuals in your life where the relationship has really run its course and you no longer need to be in those relationships. You no longer want to be in those relationships. And that can be a really interesting exercise. It's one that I did when I went through my coach training. They requested, it was part of a worksheet or a workbook where you needed to categorize people into A, B, C, or D. That was a very interesting exercise because it's pretty clear who you're going to put in your A list, but that D list was really, really hard to define. And you might argue a category of clutter, right? People who maybe you are better off to start moving away from. So whatever form clutter takes, right? Whether it's physical or mental, whether it's time clutter, whether it's written clutter, more often than not, that clutter is the result of an unmade decision. And within those unmade decisions, often the decision is deciding to let something go. And that can be a really tough decision to make, right? It could be the decision to say no to something that you've traditionally said yes to. It might be the decision to make something go that you see as a sunk cost, right? Maybe something that you invested a lot of time and money in that now you're saying goodbye to. It might be a decision that would feel wasteful, right? I don't know if this happens to you, but when I clean up after dinner, I'm often putting some of the food into the fridge thinking, well, we're going to eat these leftovers tomorrow or the next day. And I make that decision in the moment. And a few days later, when I'm cleaning up the fridge, I'll find these scraps of leftovers that have now gotten moldy or they're past the point of human consumption. And then it's an easier decision to make. But you might argue that I could have made that decision at the outset, right? But that would be wasteful in my mind, right? So you might have some decisions where you're not willing to waste something. And so you park it and that becomes clutter. You might have trouble admitting to yourself that you don't want something, right? So your preferences over time will change. Something that you may have loved 5 years ago, you may no longer love. You may not see that in your future, and yet you don't want to let go of it, whether it's an item of clothing, whether it's a type of work you do, whether it's a job that you're in. And then finally, kind of along those lines, it's saying goodbye to something that at one point you really, really loved, but you no longer see it in your life, right? It's something that doesn't belong in your future. Now, I'm going to offer you some ideas about how to recognize clutter, how to deal with clutter, how to move away from clutter. And before I do that, I just want to highlight that this episode is not about trying to make you feel bad or about feeling ashamed or embarrassed or beating yourself up over the fact that you have clutter. That is not the objective at all. We all have clutter. It is part of life, right? Things start to pile up. That's just how it works. Today's episode is about helping you open up those closet doors, literally and metaphorically, so that number one, you can shed light for yourself on where there is clutter in your life and to see how it might be slowing you down or holding you back. And secondly, to give you strategies, right, about how to make those decisions, right? Going back to this idea that clutter is often described as unmade decisions. If that's the case, what are the decisions that you need to make? And how can you make those decisions so that you can release that clutter from your life with confidence, with the result that you will have greater clarity, right? You won't be blinded or your vision won't be muddled by all this clutter that is in front of you. You'll have the peace of mind of just that feeling of being free from the clutter. And then finally, you'll be able to move more quickly toward what it is you want because you won't be almost like tackling the obstacles of clutter that are currently standing in your way. So, as I mentioned, clutter is a part of life. It is perfectly normal. And you might ask yourself how clutter gets generated. And as I was thinking about clutter in preparation for this episode, I divided it into a number of different categories. So there's at the very kind of innocuous end of the spectrum or the light, easy clutter end of the spectrum, what I refer to as this innocent clutter, right? It's the clutter that generates because you're busy and you just don't really see it because you're so busy. So what might that look like? It's just piles of paper on your desk. Maybe it's filing that you just need to hand over to your assistant so they can put it where it belongs. It might be shoes that are piled up by your door because you've just kind of come in, kicked your shoes off, and run into the house to do what it is that you need to do. So this is the kind of clutter that you don't really notice until you step away from it. If you go on vacation, for example, and you come back and you're like, oh, wow, there's that pile over there of paper, or, ooh, like these shoes, they kind of look messy. I could tidy that up. Another time that you might see it is when you have guests over. And so you're doing a scan of your house and all of a sudden you notice a bunch of clutter that you hadn't really noticed before. So that I would say is pretty easy. I'm busy, not tough decisions to make, but decisions nonetheless that you would need to make. Relatively easy though. And then there's another layer of clutter. And this is where it starts to get a little bit trickier. And this is the procrastination clutter. These are decisions that you need to make or tasks that you need to do. So I mentioned dinner leftovers, right? That food at the end of a meal, for example, that you might decide that you don't want to throw away because maybe it was food that, you spent a lot of time preparing. It was, I struggle with meat. If we have a dish that has a lot of meat in it and then there's leftover meat, I feel worse throwing away the meat than I would rice, for example. And so the decision that I often make is, okay, well, I'll put it in the refrigerator and then we'll eat it later. So it's procrastination. It's putting off into the future something that may or may not happen. Other examples of this procrastination clutter, if you get a ticket right? You might get a ticket for parking or something like that where you think, I could probably challenge this ticket. So instead of paying the ticket, you put the ticket to the side and you look at the deadline and you think, okay, maybe I'll get to challenging this ticket. Broken things. So if you have a mug, for example, where the handle has broken off and you think, okay, I'm going to go to the store, buy some crazy glue, I'll glue the handle back on, and then that mug will be good as new. And the mug just sits there on your countertop, waiting, waiting for the purchase of the crazy glue, which doesn't seem to be happening. So that's the clutter that's a little bit more involved than just rearranging your shoes by the front door. This is something that you actually have to do, right? You either have to decide not to contest the ticket, you have to decide to throw away the food, you have to decide to simply go ahead and fix the mug, but you're not, right? Instead, you're leaving it somewhere and it's becoming clutter. Then you get into the next category of clutter, and that's what I call sticky clutter. So you're beyond procrastination. You've got a task to do, but sticky is when it gets a little bit more difficult, right? It's more than not having the time or not really feeling like going to the store and buying the glue. It's like there's a conversation there that you're trying to avoid, right? There could be a conversation that you need to have with a colleague or your assistant, or maybe you've got someone who helps you with your kids and you need to talk to them about it, but you don't want to because they're looking after your kids. And what if it gets awkward? It might be a conversation with your partner about something that's been bothering you. It might be a conversation with another family member. It might also be work related, right? We all have those files that are those languishing files, right? Where you know that you need to go back to the file, you need to revisit, you need to see what the next steps are, you need to send an email, you need to give the client an update. Every time you go to do it, you dread it, and then it starts to have had a certain amount of time pass and you feel almost guilty going back to the file and you're kind of embarrassed. So you push it out even longer and then something else will come in. You'll think, well, this email needs a response. It's a lot shinier. It's a lot more exciting. And so you focus on that instead. And meanwhile, the file starts to get more stale. And so that's that third category, right? It's a little bit stickier than that procrastination pile. And you start to get a little bit more emotionally invested, right? There's a little bit of dread there. There's a conscious pushing off of something that you do not want to do. And then that brings us to the fourth category, which I've described as the skeleton in the closet clutter, right? This is the clutter where you've really pushed it to the recesses of your mind, to the recesses of your closet, because it's a big-ish decision that you need to make that you do not want to make. I see this a lot when it comes to career decisions, right? Should you leave a job that you are in where you're not really happy and you don't really see a future, and yet you're comfortable where you are, you've invested a lot, you have a lot of really good relationships, and so you're kind of stuck. So that decision gets shoved way back in the corner of the closet because it's painful. It's very uncomfortable to revisit that question. So when you have something like that, clutter like that, it feels heavy. You might feel trapped. It might feel overwhelming. You don't know where to start. And so it's easier to just shut the door. So what you might imagine, right? If you're thinking about physical clutter, you might have a drawer in your kitchen, for example, where everything just goes to live, right? If it doesn't have a proper home somewhere in your kitchen, it goes into a drawer. And when you open that drawer, ooh, this is horrific. There's tape, there's scissors, there's twist ties, there's electronic devices, there's plugs, there's sewing needles. Like there's all the random things that just kind of get shoved into the drawer. And you look in there and you think, oh, this is really messy. I don't even know what to do with this. And so you just shut the door. In our house, our garage has become this place, right? We have like this halfway house for unmade decisions in our garage, where if it doesn't belong in the house, but we don't want to throw it away, it has now migrated to the garage. So you open the door and there are skeletons all over the place, decisions that we just don't want to make. Most often the decision being, do we simply let this thing go? So you might ask yourself, what questions, what decisions are languishing? What are these metaphorical and actual skeletons that by actual, I mean a physical manifestation of clutter, but also what are some of the bigger decisions, the mental clutter, the decision clutter that is weighing on you, right? That you want to eventually deal with. And at the core of each of these types of clutter, right, is a decision, right? Either you're going to fix something or you're going to get rid of it altogether, right? You're going to do it, or you're not going to do it. So there's a decision to be made. Now, what often happens, and the reason that we get to clutter in the first place, is that the decision feels uncomfortable, right? if you're thinking about clutter where you don't want to let something go, often there's that feeling of nostalgia or sentimental attachment, right? So if you've had loved ones who have passed away and you've been given some of their art or some jewelry or something from their house, some teacups or plates or glasses or a blanket, and you don't use it, you have no use for it, but you feel so guilty giving it away, you're holding on to it for feelings of nostalgia, sentimentality. And so it can feel really uncomfortable to be the person that would give away something like that. And you may have clutter that is almost like the fantasy that you'll use it in the future clutter, right? That could be notebooks or daytimers or clothing or even books that you think that you'll read or other things that you hold on to thinking that at some point in the future you're going to use it, and yet deep down you know that you're probably actually never going to use it. And with clothing in particular, you might think, well, by the time I choose to actually wear that thing, it probably won't be in style anymore. So that can be another reason why we're so uncomfortable getting rid of the clutter. Clutter can also be the result of confusion over what to do with something, right? So I don't know about you, but I feel very confused by my children's art projects and their school projects and a lot of the things that they bring home. I look at it and I instantly feel overwhelmed because I don't know what to do with it, right? Do I throw it away? In which case I think I'm probably a bad mother, right? That sentimentality comes in. Or do I keep it? In which case I feel like a hoarder because I've got so much art. I don't know where to put it anymore. So that confusion could be part of it. Wastefulness, right? We don't want to get rid of something that could have usefulness at some point. Sunk costs, right? We've spent a lot of time and money and we've invested all this. And that can be for relationships. That can be for physical things. It could be for career decisions. So that sunk costs rationale. And then there could also be those feelings of shame and dread and resentment, right? Every time you think of making a decision about something, it might bring up a lot of really difficult emotions for you. And so you just want to avoid it altogether, right? That's where you kind of shove that decision far away to a place where you just don't need to make the decision. So instead of doing the thing or dealing with the thing, getting rid of it, doing the proactive step that is required to complete the task, having the conversation, writing the letter, sending the email, you avoid it. And instead of it getting easier to make the decision, now I think there is an exception, right? When you have the thing that you push off, right? The food that goes into the fridge that eventually spoils, then it's really easy to make that decision, right? Because it's no longer a decision, right? You have no choice, right? Nobody's going to eat a moldy piece of cheese, right? So in a way it gets easier, but most decisions that you're pushing off don't get easier to make. And it's almost like you can imagine having a living room with a lot of ornaments in it, right? Imagine a bunch of coffee tables and side tables, and on every table you've got these little tiny trinkets, and every so often you have to go and dust off these trinkets. That's what it's like for these unmade decisions, for all this clutter. It's still there. You still have to look at it. You still have to take care of it. You still have to decide when you see that clutter over and over again, are you going to keep it, right? Over the weekend, I went into my medicine cabinet and identified a bunch of perfume and potions and lotions and things that I will just never use, right? I've looked at them dozens of times before and I just decided time is time. Like, let's just get rid of these things because having to remake that decision over and over again is exhausting, right? You're depleting a resource that is really precious that can be used to make really sophisticated decisions. I don't need to use that energy to decide whether or not I'm ever going to wear this perfume again, right? Let's make the decision once and be done with it. So that lack of decision making, the increase in clutter, takes your time, right? Because you're now maintaining it, you're remaking decisions over and over again. And so when you can actually deal with the clutter and either decide you're going to keep it and care for it or you're going to be done with it, then you have this freedom on the other side, right? If you don't make a decision, you end up with the clutter. You might feel overwhelmed and you feel trapped by it. But if you can get rid of it, there is this freedom on the other side of it. So how do you get there, right? If you're living in an environment right now where there's clutter, right? Maybe there's clutter on your calendar. You're committing to things that you really don't want to do and you want to find a way out, or your workspace is just a mess and you're trying to figure out how to deal with the desktop on your computer. You're trying to deal with the different piles of paper on your desk. If you are thinking about your home, for example, and maybe you've got clutter on your kitchen counter or clutter on the kitchen table. So, how do you go about dealing with clutter when it can feel overwhelming and you can feel trapped? So, here are some ideas for helping you to deal with the clutter, much of which involves making decisions and having a strategy. So, 6 suggestions altogether. I'm going to share those with you. And as I go through these suggestions, again, the idea here is never, never, never to make you feel badly about the clutter. This is simply to normalize the conversation and to help you have ideas for how you can attack or manage or proactively deal with any clutter that is coming up in your life. So, suggestion number 1 is to accept that clutter is going to continue to regenerate itself and that the exercise of decluttering is something that will happen in layers, right? I always love thinking of the onion analogy whenever I think of layers, right? You peel off one layer of the onion and there's this fresh new layer. And so you just keep getting to peel back the layers of the onion. So clutter is kind of like that, right? You're going to start decluttering and then you'll notice that there are new areas, new decisions for you to make. Now, this is not an overnight process, right? In fact, it's an indefinite process, right? It's much more of a practice because the clutter will continue to regenerate. And so the exercise here is to become a person who has a practice of consciously decluttering. So it probably didn't become a clutter, right? If you're looking at any form of clutter, it probably didn't get cluttered in the first place overnight. And so solution is not going to be overnight either. So it's going to require some patience, persistence, discipline. And as you start to declutter, you're going to notice fresh clutter come in, and that is okay. We're going to give you all the time you need to address the clutter. Now, one suggestion that I have is to then, once you've accepted this is ongoing, is to start identifying the clutter and to make a list. So this might feel a little bit overwhelming. I'm a huge proponent of lists. I really like them because what they do is they take thoughts, right? Let's say you have a lot of clutter, mental clutter, for example. Maybe you've got decisions that you haven't made and they're weighing on you. If you were to make a list of those decisions, you can now see them on a piece of paper. They are externalized. It makes them a lot more palatable, a lot less overwhelming. So if, for example, you have a kitchen table that is cluttered. Right now, our kitchen table is cluttered. It's an ongoing problem in our house because that's where things get put. So if I think about what's on there, there's some art from my children. There's some paper on the table. There are some knickknacks. My son is doing a scrunchie making project for school. So there's some fabric, there's some scrunchies, there's some needles, etc. So just making a list, right? So where is the clutter? Where is it in your house? Where is it in your work? Where is it in your life? So if you start to make a list of the clutter, you're now externalizing it. It's no longer something that lives within your head. It's on a piece of paper. So as I was thinking of today's episode, I was thinking you could almost create a taxonomy, right? A taxonomy of clutter. And a couple of ways that you might categorize the clutter. Well, you might approach it in the categories I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, right? Time clutter, right? If you do an audit of the way that you're spending your time, where you have booked appointments into your calendar, how you spent yesterday, how you spent your last week, you might start to look for the clutter. It could be physical clutter in your workspaces, on your computer. It could be electronic clutter. Where is the clutter that shows up in a physical form at work, at home? It could be mental or emotional clutter. Do you find yourself ruminating over certain decisions, in which case you might want to write down what that clutter is, what decisions are unmade? Is there people clutter, right? Are there people in your life where you feel exhausted and you might think about increasing your boundaries when it comes to certain relationships? And writing clutter, right? Again, I think that your written work can be such an interesting reflection of how you think. And for sure, as a practitioner, I have definitely noticed that when I feel, and I no longer write legally, right? But when I used to write memos and opinions, I would find that the more confident that I felt about the opinion that I was giving, right? The research that I had done and where something belonged, right? How I was explaining something, it always got easier to write it. It was less cluttered as my confidence increased. So you might think about when you're writing, right? Whether it's an email, whether it's a legal analysis, where is there clutter in the language and how can you write with more confidence? How can you lessen the clutter? So these are all areas where you might start noticing, right? Here's some clutter. And the reason we want to notice it is because once we start paying attention to it, we can start to deal with it more effectively, right? We see it, we can't really unsee it, but we can absolutely do something about it. So when you identify the clutter, you might also go back to that question of what type of clutter is it, right? Is it that innocent, innocuous, I just didn't have time to deal with it type of clutter, in which case you might just need to set aside a few minutes to put everything in a pile or put it away, file it somewhere? Or is it that procrastination clutter, right? Is there a task that you need to do? So either you're going to throw away your favorite mug or you're going to fix it, in which case you might decide, right? Okay, I'm going to give myself until the end of the week. And if I don't fix the mug by then, it's out of here, or ask somebody else to fix it for you. Or is it sticky clutter, right? Is there something uncomfortable that's on your agenda and you just don't want to do it? Is there a file that is sitting there languishing that you know you want to deal with, but you just haven't been? Is it that kind of clutter? Or is it a skeleton in the closet, right? Is there a really big decision that you know that you need to make, but you've been avoiding it? So just by taking the clutter, making a list, maybe thinking about the categories, giving it a sense of an urgency, all you're doing here is noticing, right? You're noticing, you're evaluating, you're externalizing. Once you have clutter ahead of you, it becomes an exercise in then addressing it. So how do you address clutter, right? And chances are, if there's clutter, you are busy, you are overwhelmed, you do have a lot on your plate. And, clutter isn't stuff that we typically get really excited about dealing with, right? As I mentioned earlier, usually this is the result of an unmade decision and a decision that feels uncomfortable, right? Regardless of which way you decide to go, right? If you're giving something away, letting something go, there's the discomfort of holding on to it and the time and the energy that you're losing by doing so. Or there's the discomfort of letting it go and feeling that sense of loss, feeling the sense of FOMO, whatever it happens to be. So we know that there's going to be a certain level of discomfort. There's going to be a certain volume, a number of decisions. And so how do you go about dealing with that, right? So that your clutter, right, your list of clutter doesn't become another list in itself that you're now having to deal with, right? It's like the clutter of the clutter. It's almost like a meta clutter. So how do you want to deal with it? I would invite you to prioritize the list. If you do have a list, and it doesn't even have to be a complete list, maybe you just decide right now, I'm going to list out 5 items of clutter. Doesn't matter what type of clutter, I'm just going to make a list of 5 and I'm going to stop. Because if I make a list of all of the clutter, it would become way too overwhelming. So let's say there's 5 things, and then you just want to prioritize those 5 things, right? We want to work in small batches, one at a time. We've got lots and lots of layers. We've got all the time that we need because this is an ongoing project. There's no rush. And so we're going to start. Maybe we're going to pick 5 items, and then we're going to decide what is it that's going to be dealt with first. Now, when you deal with your clutter, you want to figure out what is going to work best for you. I find sometimes the easiest thing is the first thing that I will do because something easy will build momentum, right? You will have the satisfaction when you do the really easy clutter, right? If it's rearranging the shoes by the door, you'll feel so good, right? There's an instant payoff. You have the gratification of looking at the order and the peace and the straightened appearance that you have created. It's funny. I remember working with somebody years ago who said, there's no right angle or a right angle isn't a wrong angle or anyways, wow, I can't remember the exact expression, but the idea was you want things that are right angle. Anyhow, so you might think about the right angles in your world. If you put everything at a right angle, would it look better? Would that create that immediate sense of gratification where you start to see the benefit? And then you also start to identify yourself as a person who lives in a place where there's greater order. So you might start with the hard thing first. Now, sometimes the reason for the clutter is actually a skeleton in the closet, right? So if I think about our house project, I've talked about it on the podcast before. We've outgrown our house. This has been going on forever. Well, not forever, but for a few years. It's almost like we're slowly bursting at the seams. And there's a much bigger decision that rests beneath the clutter decisions, which is this house probably isn't the right house for us, which raises all these other questions about, well, if it's not the right house, then where do we go? And do we need to move out of the area that we're in? And what's that going to look like? So there's a lot more to it. So this question of clutter could be solved by simply buying a new house or selling the house or deciding to move, right? That would be a really big decision that would then unlock a whole bunch of other clutter decisions. But that feels too heavy. So for the time being, I've made a different decision, which is a house project where I'm doing all these mini renovation projects within the house. It feels a lot more palatable. I don't feel ready yet to make that big skeleton in the closet decision. So for you, you might think about like, is there a big decision that you could make, and are you ready to make it? You might be ready to make that decision, right? If you're having a lot of problems at work and there are relationships that are not great and the type of work that you're doing is not what you want, and you're trying to figure out like, can I make it work where I am? Can I make this work? Or is it really a question of, you know what, like I know that this isn't the right job for me. I know I just need to do something else. In which case, if you were to change from job A to job B, all those micro decisions go away, right? Because you're now putting yourself in a new environment that is more aligned with what you actually want. So you need to decide based on your comfort levels, based on where you're at, which decision is going to be the best one for you. So is it the easiest first? Is it the hardest one first? Is there a linchpin decision that you could make that would change everything? You might also ask yourself, where are you most bothered by the clutter, right? If there's a certain amount of clutter that just like is grating on you, you might choose to do that one first. So that's prioritizing the list. So going back to where we started, what we're talking about here in terms of the strategies is number one, to expect that this is an ongoing project. You're working in layers. We're peeling off the layers of the onion. The second is to make a list of all the clutter, right? You can make a giant master list of clutter items and then attack it one piece at a time. Or maybe you just want to list out a few items because listing everything out would be overwhelming. That's fine, whatever works for you. Then of the items that you've written down, you want to take a small batch, right? Maybe 1 to 5 items and just start identifying the order in which you're going to tackle the clutter. And then the next one is to set a deadline. Now, I know I said earlier that clutter is something that we're going to work on over time, so we don't have to be in a rush or anything, but deadlines really do help, regardless of whether you stick to the deadline, right? Let's say you've got a broken mug, you say, I'm going to deal with it by the end of the week. If you give yourself that deadline and then you meet that deadline, right? By the end of the week, you have fixed the mug. Great. Then you've got that satisfaction of a job well done. Or you realize at the end of the week, you didn't do it. So maybe give yourself an extension. You might notice if you're pushing it week to week that maybe you just need to throw out that mug, or maybe you just need to ask somebody else to do it, whatever it happens to be. Maybe it's just not that important to you. But a deadline will create momentum, especially if you take your deadlines seriously. And for that reason, I would encourage you to set deadlines that you think you're going to meet, ones that are realistic, and to reward yourself when you meet a deadline, right? The purpose of the deadline is to motivate you. It's to set it in motion. So write down your deadline, maybe commit to somebody else, tell them that you've created this deadline. If you need to, if it's a big project, create a backward plan. So if it's the mug project, maybe you put in there that you're going to go to the drugstore tomorrow and buy the glue. The next day, you're going to glue the mug together. The next day, you're going to wash the mug and see if it actually worked. This is the mug example. If it's something that is work related, that would be different, right? If you decide, okay, you know what, like I'm going to give my job a fair shot and I'm going to have these 3 conversations. And then from there, I'm going to decide whether or not this can be resolved, whether this is the right spot for me. If you've got that languishing file that's sitting in the back of your file cabinet, maybe you give yourself a list, right? Okay, by the end of the week, I will have reported to the client. That means that step 1, I'm going to open the file. Step 2, I'm going to review it. Step 3, I'm going to identify any outstanding items. I'm going to identify next steps. So you want to give yourself a nice list of things, working your way backwards, so that when you decide to deal with this thing, deal with the clutter, you actually have an actionable plan to do that. You've got a deadline, you know exactly what you need to do. It's very clear for you. So then going to the next step, for each item of clutter, I would like you to define for yourself the decision that you need to make, right? You need to evaluate whether it's something that you want to keep, whether it's something that you want to let go. If you're keeping it, do you need to put it somewhere? Do you need to do something with it? And so taking this to a more granular way of looking at it, what kind of clutter might you be dealing with? Well, if it's physical clutter, you might be looking at paper files. You might be looking at electronic files. You might be looking at emails. If it's time clutter, right, you might be looking at your calendar. What did you do yesterday, last week? I love auditing time and just asking yourself, did the things that you did today, yesterday, last week, last month, did the way you spent your time align with your greater objectives? Does it align with your priorities and your goals, right? Maybe there's time with friends in there that you're like, yep, that was amazing. But there was also time that you spent scrolling on social media where you're like, no, not so much. Like I didn't get a lot out of that. Or maybe there were social events that you committed to where you think, you know what, like that was 3 hours of my life that I'll never get back. I wish I'd just said no in the first place. So you want to evaluate where the clutter is showing up. It might be that thinking or emotional clutter, right? Were there things that you were ruminating about, decisions that you weren't making? Maybe you were beating yourself up over something having gone sideways. Is that really how you want to spend your time? And then when you're thinking about the clutter and trying to decide if you want it in your life, what are some of the questions that you can ask yourself? Well, one question might be, is it current? Is it something that you currently use, right? If it's a file, for example, and it's closed, it doesn't need to be there. You can put it away. But if it's a file that you're actively working on, then yeah, maybe you do want to keep it handy. If it's something in your closet, for example, is it an item of clothing? Do you actually use it currently? And if not, is it something that you're saving because you'll wear it next time you have a special occasion? Or is it one of those fantasy items where you think, of course I'll wear these sequin shoes to something when you know deep down you'll never wear them? Then do you want to keep them or do you want to let them go? So you're asking yourself whether or not the thing is current. Do you actually use it? Do you need it? If yes, does it have a place, right? Where do you want to put that thing so that it is not clutter, right? It's actually got a home. It lives somewhere where it belongs. You might ask yourself, do you love it, right? Again, thinking about all the ways that clutter might show up. If it's on your calendar, do you love doing it? Does it serve a purpose? If it's people in your life, right? Are these people that you truly love? Or are these people who maybe play a very peripheral role in your life and you don't need to be giving them so much of you, so much of your time, so much of your energy? Would you choose it again? Is this thing, right? This item, is it something that you would purchase again if you bought it from a store? If it's a type of work, would you actively solicit that type of work? Or is it something that you're holding on to because it is secure, it feels safe, and yet, maybe you've outgrown it, you don't want to do it anymore? And then finally, does it belong in your future? I love thinking about what the future holds, where I want my practice to go, what I want my house to look like, what I want my health to be like. And you might ask yourself those same questions. What do you see in the future, right? If you've got kids, they're growing up, they're changing. Your professional work is changing. You are changing. So at the different stages of your life, you're thinking about where you're going. And does that clutter, does it belong there, right? If you're spending a lot of time second guessing your decisions, do you want that to be part of your identity going forward? Or do you want to build the skill and the capacity of being a more decisive person who can leave things behind them? So other decisions that you might be thinking about, the willingness to deliver bad news, the willingness to take a position on something that really might speak to the whole idea of writing or giving your opinion, verbal clutter. If you are dancing around a question, not wanting to commit one way or the other, do you need to make a choice there? Would it be easier for you to articulate your position if you simply made a decision and went with it? In which case, you may need to take responsibility for that decision. You might have to take responsibility if you make the wrong decision, and arguably wrong. I have a whole other concept when it comes to decisions, but there you go. So that was the fifth idea. So just going back again, you're going to address your clutter in layers. It's going to continue to regenerate. And so we want to make it a practice. We're going to expect that there's going to be new clutter, and that's okay. We're just going to make a practice and a habit out of dealing with it. We're going to address the clutter by simply noticing where it is, making a list if that's what you like to do. And from that list, we're going to then work on that list with just a few items at a time, right? I think I said 1 to 5 items, whatever number is comfortable for you. You can decide whether to start with the easy stuff first, the hard stuff first, whatever makes the most sense to you. Whatever you're most likely to act on is what I would recommend. Just set some deadlines for yourself, just to create that additional accountability, to try to generate the momentum that you'll need to start dealing with the clutter. And then for each item of clutter, right? How are you going to address that? Chances are there's a decision. So what is the decision that you need to make? What are some of the questions you can ask yourself, right? Is it current? Do you love it? Would you choose this thing again? Does it have a home? Does it belong in your future? These are all questions that will help you decide whether or not something gets to stay or gets to go. If it stays, what will you do with it? And then finally, that leads us to the last step, which is to prepare for the emotional discomfort of the decisions you're going to make, right? If you are saying goodbye to something, chances are the reason it's so hard for you is you've got FOMO, right? The fear of missing out, or you are being held back by that notion of sunk costs. You've spent so much time, you've spent so much energy, right? You bought the dress, you committed to the job, you've been there 10 years, 20 years, you're really good at it, it's comfortable, it's easy, it's predictable, and yet there's something else that you want. There might be guilt, right? That file that you haven't touched in 3 weeks where you told the client you get back to them right away. So you might feel guilt and shame and embarrassment over the fact that you haven't actually addressed it. Maybe you're dealing with someone else's clutter. Like if you've got kids at home and they have all the clutter in their room and you open the door, you look at it and you think, oh, I don't want to do this. You might feel resentment, right? That why is it you that needs to go and deal with the clutter? Why can't somebody else do it? Or if you've got somebody, for example, where you need to have a pretty serious conversation with them, right? Maybe you're delegating a task, whether at work or outside of work, and that person isn't doing it. And you have feelings of anger toward them and frustration. That might be a reason why you're putting off that conversation. And so dealing with the difficult emotions that come from dealing with the clutter, that is going to be part of your task list, right? Is to identify, okay, like I'm really going to feel upset here. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. I'm going to feel resentful, or I'm going to feel there's FOMO. You might feel wasteful. This is why I have such a hard time throwing away the leftovers at the end of a meal. It's much easier for me to throw away whatever it is, the uneaten steak, 3 days later than it is in the moment. And so just notice for yourself, what is the uncomfortable emotion that you're going to have to feel? And here, I think it's kind of helpful to think of the clay pots analogy. It relates back to an experiment that I heard about a few years ago, where a group of people were asked to create clay pots. And one group was instructed to make a single clay pot within a certain time frame. Maybe it was an hour. And the objective was to make a perfect clay pot. And the other group was given the task of just making as many clay pots as they possibly could within the same time frame. And interestingly, what they found was that the group that was assigned the task of making as many clay pots as they possibly could ended up producing better pots than the group that had one pot that they made perfectly. So when it comes to you and your clutter and making decisions to address your clutter, I would encourage you not to focus so much on making the perfect decision with respect to each item of clutter. I would invite you to just make as many decisions as you possibly can, because number one, you'll deal with a lot more clutter. And number two, you'll get better at making those decisions, right? Just because you've been practicing. So the reason that this will work for you, right? If you take a proactive approach to removing the clutter, right? Freeing up your time, getting rid of the clutter, is that the minute you make a decision, right? The minute you throw something in the garbage, you relieve yourself of the clutter and you can move on and move forward to the next step. Now, you also open a window for something new to come in. You imagine, for example, your closet. And if you have a closet right now that is full of clothing that is so-so, right? It makes you feel like you have a full closet, but actually none of it is wearable. If you go and remove all of those items that you're not actually using, you'll see that there's now space. And so you see where the gaps are, and there's actually space for something new to come in. That's your closet, your physical clothing closet. But think about all the other ways in which decluttering can free up space for something new to come in. If you stop working on a certain type of file, or you start turning away work that comes from particular clients because it doesn't align with your practice, because they're really challenging, complicated people, for example, to deal with, right? Where you think, 80% of my effort is spent on 28% of my clients. Maybe there needs to be a shift there. And it might feel really scary at first, right? It's like looking at your closet and thinking, well, now I only have 3 things hanging in there. But the reality is you may have had only 3 wearable things, but your closet looked full. It might feel the same way with your practice, right? If you start decluttering your practice, you might think, oh, but I don't really have a lot left. It can feel really uncomfortable, right? It can trigger that scarcity mindset, but it also frees up an opportunity for you to say, well, now I see where the gaps are and I can proactively go and fill them. So when you let go of the clutter, you open the door to something new, something different, and something that ideally aligns more with where you want to go in the future, as opposed to where you're coming from in the past. Now, with that less clutter, that reduced amount of clutter, you'll have greater clarity because you can actually see. Chances are you'll feel freer, right? Lighter. You've now released all that clutter. You're not maintaining it. You're not redeciding on whether or not to keep something. And you'll start to gain momentum, right? With each fresh decision that you make, you will feel more like a decisive person. You can move forward and you'll increase your comfort with making decisions until you form a habit. And habits are extremely powerful. You very likely already have a number of very helpful habits in your life. Brushing your teeth is a lovely habit. Having set meal times, for example, is a nice habit. Routines at the office is a nice habit. Routines for exercise. The more you make habits part of your life, the fewer decisions that you're making. And so if you've got a habit of decluttering, it will build on itself. It's like a positive snowball effect. And then finally, you will become a person who makes faster decisions. And what you'll notice overall is that the clutter has now started to dissipate, right? It's starting to go away. Now, what you'll need in order to follow through on the decluttering, to reduce the clutter, is the confidence to make decisions. It's tough, especially if these are difficult decisions that you don't want to make. Part of the exercise is simply stepping into that place of confidence where you trust yourself to make maybe not the right decision, right? Often there isn't a right or a wrong decision. You simply make a decision and then what follows from that decision will happen. And you just need to trust that you're doing what's best for you in the moment with the information that you have and that you will have your own back no matter what the outcome. So you're building your confidence to make decisions. You need to be willing to feel discomfort. The willingness to take responsibility for someone else being disappointed, the willingness to take responsibility for throwing away those blankets and the artwork and the glasses and the dishes that meant so much to somebody who you love, which will never find a place in the home that you live in. And then finally, it's the discipline to practice making decisions, right? A lot of this comes down to discipline. It means prioritizing the decluttering process. It means choosing that, which then requires that habit, that practice, that self-discipline to follow through. What will result is you'll make more decisions. You will have less clutter. You'll have greater peace of mind as the clutter is gone. As you look at your desk and you can see your top 3 projects, it's very clear. You look at your desktop and everything's organized really neatly. You look in your closet and everything in there is something that you could actually wear today if you needed to. You look at your calendar and there's not a bunch of activities on there that you didn't want in the first place. So you've got that peace of mind, you've got that clarity of where to go, you've got space for new things, and you step into the concept, the self-concept of a clutter-free person. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode. And as you move forward into this next week, I'd love to offer you a challenge. And that challenge is simply for you to explore areas in your life. Just notice where the clutter is lingering, right? Whether it's that skeleton in the closet type of clutter, or you just start rearranging the shoes at the front of the door, pick an area and practice that decision-making, practice that decluttering. Ask yourself what decisions are represented by the clutter and then start making those decisions. So whenever you need a refresher, you're always welcome to come back to this episode. If you want to let me know how this process is going for you, I would love to hear from you. I'd love to hear about the decluttering that's going on in your life. And I'm so glad you joined me for this episode. I hope that you make tangible steps as a result. And I just wish you a fabulous week. So happy decision making, happy decluttering. I'm very excited to have you here this week, and I look forward to reconnecting again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.